This is a film about cities. It is a film about how cities face up to their futures and the methods they use to try to manage them. Today, the future looms over cities in a hyper-connected tangle of crises. Sharpening inequalities, carbon-climate feedback, technological acceleration, opaque financial infrastructures combine in a clamour for new ideas, new plans, new methods. But city futures are never just about cities, and they are never just about futures. They are about policies and deals, actors and sectors, ideas and theories, instruments and methods. And they are about places, sunk in space, meshed across regions and nations, and curved across the globe. They are inherently, dynamically relational and radically contingent. The next fold of the future contains multitudes.
Every city is essentially imaginary. None of this is natural or inevitable. Every single building that you see around us in London or any city came from someone's mind. So it was planned, there was a blueprint, it didn't need to exist. We can fool ourselves into thinking that there's the fictional world and there's the non-fiction world, but very, very often the two are just so intertwined that it's impossible. It's like a Gordian knot, they're inextricable.
Edinburgh's breweries, paper mills and factories have always been crammed into the gaps between the banking, insurance and university buildings of this inspiring capital. The centre slopes down off the city's 7 hills, overshadowing its suburbs and peripheries. A city of money for 3 centuries before its big banks fell in 2008, the fault lines connecting Edinburgh to its industrial histories and geographies have left faint traces. These lines matter though. Between the acknowledged past and the imagined future, the lines connecting land and water, science and industry, government and universities, people and money, are the formula, the twisted helix meant to fix the trouble we're in.
The big story in Edinburgh is obviously what happened 250 years ago. The new town development still dominates as the big development story. And there's not really been one since. There's a bit of a malaise about, Edinburgh and development. It's a long story of projects that have started, projects that have stopped. But actually, when it comes to a new urban, there's little to grasp in a strange way, even though there's lots of land and there'll be lots of projects in part of within the urban conurbation. Edinburgh very much is the city centre and then a sort of hinterland. And I think that hinterland is much vaguer.
Cities endure only by keeping anxious eyes on the future. To regenerate post-industrial cities, grand plans have placed different sectors and combinations as the central sparks, from the arts and creative industries to finance to universities and the tech industries.
In New York City, where there were so many artists, there's a gradual realization on the part of local officials that the arts were important, and they could be important for integrating the city, they could be important for the identity of the city, but they could also be an economic driver. So creative cities as a paradigm of urban development became very popular in the 1990s and the early 2000s when Richard Florida published The Creative Class. It kind of ran out of steam in the big financial crisis of 2008. The city government gradually said, wait a minute, we're way too dependent on the financial industry, and look what the financial industry has done. So we have to find something different. In New York's case, they said, maybe we can learn something from the tech industry. After the 2008 financial crisis, cities adopted a tech strategy. In New York, there was a definite effort by the city government to attract tech companies to create the kind of triple helix that had already been developed in Silicon Valley.
Helices in double, triple, quadruple, and quintuple forms turn up everywhere. In botany, in engineering, geometry, and mythology, they describe smooth space curving forms with tangent lines pitched at constant angles. In the 1990s, the sociologists Henry Etzkowitz and Louis Ladisdorff described the strategic interactions between universities, industry, and government agencies, the science parks, venture capital, incubators, and so on, as the triple helix needed for innovation in knowledge-based economies. Since then, the model has branched out to accommodate other actors. The quadruple helix added civil society, and the quintuple helix rooted all action in the natural environment first. These three helical models track through the methods of urban innovation complexes, through city deals, and futures institutes. The United Kingdom's city deals were designed in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. As an instrument of both public finance deficit reduction and decentralised government, they cast cities as the centre points of economic growth. By 2020, there were over 30 agreements in place, all designed to incentivise the visions and strategies that might help fund and finance the urban infrastructures of the future. In Scotland, the deals were framed explicitly for city regions, and each adopted a distinct thematic focus. Glasgow's focused on transport and Aberdeen's on energy. Edinburgh's centred around data-driven innovation as the data capital of Europe. It is in this context, amidst the recognition that planning urban futures means addressing bigger, graver and costlier crises, that futures institutes are springing up.
Lots and lots of universities around the world are doing futures institutes at the moment, and I think it's the coming together of multiple global crises with accelerating technological change, with a sense of almost that futures are sort of closing down.
Right now, futures is the thing. It draws industry teams together, it draws industry and community groups together to work on something that seems kind of reasonably coherent, but is also in some ways yet to take shape.
I founded the Digital Futures Institute at King's a few years ago, and it was amazing to see at that time a number of different futures institutes coming into being with a very sort of similar impetus and somewhat compatible, slightly different but very compatible approaches. And this energy was just bubbling up at that point in quite similar ways. I think there was a sort of growing consensus that we needed different approaches if we're going to solve some of these problems, if we're going to really find new and different responses. We have to change our methods and we have to change our approaches.
So the Center for Techno-Moral Futures is really about reuniting technical knowledge and expertise with moral, political, and social knowledge and expertise. Because we've had, unfortunately, for almost a century now, a growing trend in education worldwide to split off scientific and technical expertise from moral, political, and social knowledge and expertise. And this has been devastating, actually, both for the capability of those who come from the humanities tradition or the social sciences to really understand the built world, the engineered world, and its dimensions. But equally, it has diminished the ability of engineers and those who manage and design the built world to understand what the built world is for.
It seems obvious that futures planning demands collaboration across sectors, the combination of knowledge across disciplines, and the development of new techniques and methodologies. But interdisciplinarity is a strange beast. Summoned as an objective, a solution, a cure, it can be elusive in practice.
So this is a massive sort of institutional change project. And I think for Edinburgh, that perhaps one of the most significant challenges has been around busting out some of the disciplinary silos and actually trying to start to re-engineer the university so that academics from multiple parts of the university can teach together. And that's, sounds simple, but it really isn't. It's really very difficult to do. And it's not because there's lack of will from anyone, really. It's just that the way that universities operate and the way that money flows and the way the intellectual allegiances are formed all tend to be and have been around disciplines.
We've been talking about interdisciplinarity for literally decades now. But what we usually mean by that is neighbouring disciplines working with each other. Let's face it, there hasn't been as much of a revolution around this as we might have thought there would be, given the rhetoric over many, many years.
The complications of re-engineering collaboration in a single institution multiply in the deals, partnerships and complexes being struck up across institutions and across sectors.
The city-region deal is effectively a tripartite agreement between the UK government, the Scottish government and the partners that sit within that region. So ultimately it's around a big envelope of capital expenditure and lots of projects that sit underneath that are all around creating better prosperity for the region itself. So that's ultimately how we're interconnected as organisations. Edinburgh University is a partner within that city-region deal. So I think that's allowed us, of course, to join up that approach and come together. Half the battle a lot of the time is really finding those connections, I think, and actually working together.
The trouble with helical methods that revolve around principles like interdisciplinarity, collaboration, co-design, co-production, is how to make them useful and not just magical words. For institutions with legacy infrastructures and ingrained habits, that means workarounds and retrofits. Desire, imagination, vision always figure in rhetoric, but the organisational apparatus and procedures, from budget allocations to workload management systems, matter just as much. Quadruple remodelling to include the civic sphere, as vital as it is, has not made this any easier. Edinburgh Futures Institute's location in a building that was once the UK's largest voluntary hospital and remained the city's largest until 2003 offers a poignant note.
Well, it was the People's Hospital. It was a hugely important building. Everyone over the age of 20 in Edinburgh was born here.
And it's been heartbreaking to see this building being dilapidated and broken. This building will mean a lot to a lot of people. I think that's the challenge as well. So in terms of building, civic structures, communities, those things will dramatically change the way we appreciate, use, move and feel our built environment.
I think in order for us to have that legitimacy to operate, we've got to demonstrate how that benefits the people that live here.
So I'm really interested in how societies create different forms, I suppose, of inequality, specifically in terms of ethnic and racial differences. And by inequality and different, I'm really talking about disparities. Disparities in life chances, disparities in experiences of services, but also disparities in terms of how people feel they belong to a place. How is a space organised? Whose identity is imprinted on that space? How do people who move through that space feel when they're in it? We know that minoritized people will be very guarded and careful about maneuvering themselves through places of a city that's unfamiliar to them, and indeed that may historically have a reputation of being hostile.
The material legacies of income derived from chattel slavery, hidden in plain sight across cities like Edinburgh, are a stark reminder of how conditional and how partial any claim to be open equally to all is. Planners and architects may aspire to design gregarious public places, but they work on ground contaminated by history and the chronically spatial distribution of inequalities.
I guess the starting point for the council in terms of grant to waterfront regeneration is back in 2018. But once the global credit crunch happened in 2008, most of the private sector kind of walked away from this area. It is a very challenging site in terms of steep topography, made ground. It's former brownfield land, so of course there's lots of contamination. So there's a big bill before you can actually start building housing and building a community. Public sector-led regeneration aspect of it means that I think what we can do is invest in an area and really build infrastructure and the placemaking that's required. I think a lot of previous public and private sector-led projects really are around small development sites where effectively you build some housing, the private sector makes the profit margins it seeks to make, and then it kind of walks away from the area. The whole point of regeneration in this area is about creating a new community, creating new opportunities for the people who surround it.
Public sector-led projects are better placed to level the terrain surrounding areas like Granton that have endured decades of underinvestment, marked in a patchwork of abandoned transformation projects. In theory, they can take up more time and acquire more space, but time, terms and tides drift as deals struck between private and public sector agencies navigate changing policies and governments. This makes it hard for long-term plans to endure. Generations of regeneration policies have not levelled out the inequalities that mark the city. The land's steep topography is still mirrored in the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, with the hardest challenges pushed out to the peripheries.
North Edinburgh historically has faced a lot of challenges. It houses some of the most deprived wards in the city, and it's clear when you're walking around the streets that poverty is a daily experience for many of the people who'll come through our doors. The challenge for us particularly is, how does an arts organisation make an impact or assist people who are having a very difficult time? What does it mean to work in and with communities who are facing really big structural challenges? Why would art be important in that mix?
What matters to people in terms of place, identity and belonging can throw up some surprises. Gasholder number 1 is the oldest of 3 that once stood on the site. Designed by Ralph Herring in 1899 and Category B listed by Historic Environment Scotland, the gasholder and its renovation touches and crosses all sorts of boundaries.
So it's become very much a landmark of this place. So trying to define a quite ill-defined leftover area of coast. Is it farmland? Is it suburbia? Is it, development land? What is it? It's become a useful pivot in the map for development.
The costs, the labour, the care involved in rescuing the gasholder are vast. Funded under the former UK government's Levelling Up programme, its future as a marker, a maker of place, is not so much an economic proposition as a projection born somewhere in the conversations between people living in the area, community groups, city government and industry. In local consultations, the gasholder was identified as one of the anchor sites people wanted to keep. With the city's conservation lobbies focused on the centre, the preservation of industrial landmarks in the outskirts often relies on local activists. Community activists can be the strongest drivers for change, but the voluntary service involved is an additional burden for already stressed communities.
I think people are fed up getting consulted. It tends to come back that people want somewhere safe, green and connected to live in. I mean, it's fairly normal stuff that people want. I'm just not quite sure if we've got that kind of relationship between the council and the citizen right. What does it actually mean for somebody who's living their life, in the mile around our building?
Yet leaving communities out of future planning has scarred cities in the past. Roads and railway tracks have bent around and tunnelled under affluent areas and decimated others, reinforcing ethnic, racial and social inequalities across space and time. Consultation matters, but despite the promise of democratic innovations and participatory budgeting, its costs remain underaccounted. Just as much trouble comes from the fifth twist to capture the environmental interactions of carbon and climate. The gasholder looks almost like a helix lattice, describing, while somehow obscuring, the tangential nets and lines connecting the fossils, fuel, people and resources the city depends on.
Most of Edinburgh runs on gas. This was what served the city from, the sort of early part of the 20th century onwards in different phases. But I think what's really interesting about the dominant narrative in Edinburgh is heritage, Old Town, New Town, but there's a massive 19th century industrial city just underneath there. There's a lot of brick structures around the edges, Leith, Granton, that went with a different kind of Edinburgh.
The material and social conditions that connect the old and new towns with their urban and regional situation have not played much part in how Edinburgh represents itself. Its reputation as a city of money, of science, of festivals has been cultivated, while the industrial and environmental layers on which they depend are literally and symbolically pushed out to the hinterlands. The city's foundation in coal and stone came at some cost to those who mined and quarried it.
Lots of men dying. They got lung disease because of working with the stone. These kind of infrastructures kept the new town going. That was what made it. And I think that relationship between the material cost that was involved in actually making heritage, or what's seen as a city now, it's really good just to have that raised to the surface. There's a whole dimension of the ecological, just thinking about resource, all material resource becoming something else. So there's a sort of morphological, transformative nature to, understanding that stone comes from a quarry. But what happens to that encapsulating plastic around the gasometer? Where does it go? Where did it come from?
These transformations cross and recross material, environmental, and human scales. Something like climate adaptation sounds like a plausible collective target, but it is chameleonic, unstable and dynamic in practice, another helical curve in a space where carbon and social goals are both contingent and always in flux.
So what climate adaptation approaches have struggled with is recognising the multiplicity of what we might call vulnerability to climate change. So it's been focused upon the built environment, on securing energy, on the macro engineering stuff. And it hasn't been good at understanding that in the same space, people can have very different experiences of climate change. And one of the ways in which that illustrated is in accommodation, it's in housing. Purpose-built homes which are super hot in the summer and super cold in the winter. But it's also something which is experienced at a group level. The racial dynamics of the adaptation experience, are quite stark. When we look at the data, we know that Black and ethnic minorities live typically or disproportionately in sites that we call, urban heat islands. They're places that have a significant degree of material, tarmac, concrete, which absorbs heat during the day and re-emits it during the night. The green and blue spaces of peri-urban or indeed, quite gentrified areas aren't available to them. And when you connect that to, wider patterns of comorbidities, underlying health issues, the social stresses of living and negotiating, a city as a racialized minority, then these compounding factors present a challenge to adaptation processes.
Money inevitably shapes how people in place are arranged, but the rush after 2008 to reconfigure the finance, government, innovation complex in step with the ascendant tech industries has had peculiar effects. Answers to questions about who owns and who invested in what and why tend to be arcane, implicating financial and legal instruments and dependencies that stretch across time and space. But the fog has thickened as platforms and data and finance and assets have woven more closely together. It has become harder to discern one thing from another. Where is the financial sector exactly? Where is the data? And where is the capital the city hinted it might bring?
Because of the financial crisis, the kind of locus of economic imagination in the United States sort of shifted from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. It was also the tipping point of social media. So at this moment, when money was strange, money's meaning was up for grabs, the traditional institutions that governed money seemed illegitimate, and technology was everywhere, suddenly a variety of different people began to really think about what we could do with money, what kinds of new futures we could build with new money infrastructures.
These connections between money and payment infrastructures, between smartphones and social media platforms, have concrete consequences on urban environments, how people move through them and what they do in them. And yet, the physical infrastructures of the internet, of platforms, of AI, its data centres, and its energy sources are enigmatic.
In many, many public discussions of things like AI, what we end up with is a very general version of what AI is, and we get these wild declarations about either a positive or negative future, sort of, utopian or dystopian version of the future of AI. But what we often don't get is a detailed and serious discussion of the technology itself. And so that's where I try and enter into it, by doing detailed ethnographic, up-close studies of the technology to try and unpack what is going on here, how does it work, what sorts of futures are anticipated within this, but what kinds of things are actually emerging right now too. And those have big effects on shaping the kinds of spaces that we get and how we actually experience those spaces. To turn something like a train station into a smart, connected space leads to all kinds of expectations around the data that we will provide as individuals. So things like, having access to our smartphone data, for example, having access to the data that links up what ticket have we bought, where are we going, what do we buy in the train station, how do we move through the train station. So linking up that data that we would provide with all sorts of further data from train companies, from other users of the train station, retailers within that space, police as well, and understanding, well, what's that kind of collection of data there? And then what might the future be around that?
A lot of people assume that when you're talking about futurism, you're talking about technology. And a lot of the time nowadays, the word technology really means digital technology. And sometimes you forget the kind of material reality of what goes on and where we live when we're thinking about the future. If we're saying we want a future with AI connected gizmos here, there and everywhere, but what actual impact does that have to the street I'm walking along, or the bus I take to work, or the building that I live in, or how polluted my city is? I think the importance of thinking about cities is not just a sense of infrastructure and how do we make sure we've got data centres and so on and so forth, but also thinking about the impacts on day-to-day life of what it means to live, not just how much extra can these technologies give us, but how do they change the environment.
In urban environments where daily traffic all year round is a dynamic mix of longer-term residents and shorter-term visitors, one sector of the platform economy presides.
Travel tech is sort of the catch-all term for tech companies working in tourism, travel and hospitality. So all the way from sort of big search engines for travel or trip planners, all the way to sort of hotel technology that helps those businesses run more effectively. There's almost a disparity of esteem when it comes to businesses in tourism, hospitality, travel. It's almost seen as frivolous, yet it's probably the biggest employer in the world, the travel industry. And the tech companies that are really big in travel tech, like Booking.com, Expedia, Airbnb, so on, are hugely influential, not just from a financial perspective, but also how places are formed and shaped.
The urban footprints left by ride-sharing, food delivery, dockless bike and short-term let platforms can be plain enough. But there are other, more subtle effects that are equally profound.
Airbnb, through its platform mechanisms and capitalistic logics, invites user governance. So as hosts input their listings of tours or experiences or homes in the platform, they're governed by the goals of the platform to present their homes and what they do in the city in certain ways. The platform then also associates those categories with each other in this entire kind of engine of placemaking. So if you look at Airbnb, you see things that we know in Edinburgh, Arthur's Seat or the Castle or even Scotmid, various co-ops, grocery stores around neighborhoods all have place pages within Airbnb. And so what that does is it kind of encompasses the content of a neighborhood. So in a way, it's consuming the content of a neighborhood for the purpose of booking and profiting from Airbnb stays. So those are the types of features and products, as Airbnb engineers call them, that co-opt our sense of place and space, add meaning via consumption. What is driving homeowners to put their spare room on Airbnb? What is driving external investors to buy up entire buildings and put those buildings as listings on Airbnb?
The heart of all future planning is finance, and it is the least visible, curving through space and time in dynamic frequencies. From the slow concentrations of land ownership to the hectic trade in assets, finance moves along obscure paths, linking internet and platform economies to the social infrastructures of housing, water, transport, and energy.
We invest in a whole range of assets across commercial and residential, and also what people call alternatives. At the moment, the biggest growth is logistics, distribution and the living sector. And the living sector includes build-to-rent accommodation, private rented accommodation, purpose-built student accommodation, and also hotels can fit into that category as well.
The structure, regulation and technological infrastructures of the financial industries have changed fundamentally since the 1970s. The details and the consequences of who owns what in finance have never been transparent, but they move faster now in transactions that are securitized, sliced and diced and traded among a wild array of intermediaries all over the globe. These accelerations create and disturb particular kinds of future planning.
All money is a bet on the future. We only accept money because we believe that someone else will accept it tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And so every act of faith, every act of investment or acceptance or use of money not only expresses an expectation of that future, it also summons that future.
And as money has got more abstracted, so it's less clear you're just buying coal or you're just buying gas, but you're buying shares in something or you're buying the company that trades in the shares, then it's much harder for people, I think, to take responsibility that what they're doing with money has an impact in the planet.
What kinds of urban and regional futures can be summoned when money is abstracted, refracted across the structures and interdependencies of global finance and internet economies?
Where does the money flow? There's sometimes controversy around new hotel developments, but equally there's controversy around short-term let. We know that short-term let is also being invested in by private corporations and potentially raising the prices and values of homes and makes it less accessible for people from the city or close by to live. So there's a lot of contradictions.
Contradictions and connections proliferate. The symbols and language of abstracted finance and data capital may seem to have nothing to do with hotel booking, eating out, or shopping in city centres, or social media posting. And yet,
almost every social media company, from Snapchat to Facebook to Google, has tried to make money, tried to do payments in the last decade. And at the same time, money technologies are becoming more like social media. In the US, Venmo is the most widespread form of person-to-person payments, and it literally looks like a Facebook feed where you can annotate all of your person-to-person payments with notes and jokes and emojis and GIFs, but also follow the feeds of your friends, see who they're paying, what they're paying each other for, and it's a site of new forms of sociality, new forms of surveillance, and new forms of expression.
This has profound effects on how places function, on the kinds of energy and resources they use up, how people move through them, and where different people feel they belong. "13 miles to the west, and rising 185 metres above sea level, across a 33-hectare footprint, is Green Dyke's Bing. The Bing, Old Norse for a heap or a tip, is one of 19 remnants of the shale mining industry strewn across West Lothian. Oil shales formed in the area about 340 million years ago, but mining to produce paraffin oil, or kerosene, began only in 1851. For half a century, the region was the world's biggest producer, but the market collapsed as crude oil from the Middle East took over in the 1960s. The bings are made of the spent red flakes that remain when the oil is extracted. Green Dyke's Bing is the largest survivor and a scheduled monument. Bings are archetypal boundary objects. crossing geological, environmental, industrial and cultural histories. After the paraffin market collapsed, the red flakes carpeted Scotland's central belt, infilling motorways, bricks and school playing fields, while the bings themselves slowly turned green. Willow herb, red clover and helleborine are now among 350 recorded plant species, with hares and badgers, red grouse, skylarks and ringlet butterflies. There is a museum in Livingston and an online shale trail. But if you search Broxburn Bing on YouTube, what you find is mud biking. Thrilling to watch, but illegal to do. It is impossible to explain the past or plan the futures of a place from a single vantage point. The collapse of shale, coal and manufacturing industries, and the short-lived Silicon Glen, has left most of the region far behind Edinburgh in inspiring capital. The few bright spots outside the city are largely commuter dormitories, the product of Edinburgh's unaffordable housing. Achieving the city-region deal's aim of establishing the region as the data capital of Europe, by working with partners to attract investment, fuel entrepreneurship and deliver inclusive growth, means addressing deep, difficult, profoundly intertwined challenges.
I think the big challenges that cities face are incredibly interconnected, right? So if we look at the climate problem, we look at the transport and interconnection problem, we look at how we move through space, we look at how we exist in that space, they're all kind of tied together. The data challenge is one that we can't really get beyond very easily, that we are all involved the whole time in producing huge amounts of data, that we rely on the production and analysis of that data for sensible continued existence in those spaces, movement through those spaces, living and consuming in those spaces in ways that we probably want to continue doing.
The way that we're occupying our cities and living in our cities is changing, and there's a huge amount of data out there that we're not using in terms of our decision making. The ability to have affordable accommodation is something that's a factor and a risk for almost every market that we invest into. So in the developed world and parts of the undeveloped world, it's probably the number one political topic. For us, an asset manager investing into the built environment, having a long-term perspective on the future of our cities is the most important thing.
City-region deals, futures institutes and innovation complexes are helical methods for managing the future by weaving all the stakeholders together, but they are complex in perplexing ways.
Every city has wound up building an innovation center that may, if it grows into an ecosystem together with private businesses, will become the center of what I like to call an innovation complex, both in the sense of a whole complex of multi-use buildings and also a psychological complex of inferiority. This nagging anxiety that this city is lagging behind other cities in its competitive ability to attract the dynamic part of the tech industry.
There are places where this nagging anxiety and competitive aggression can prompt the most dystopic of future visions, where a helical mix of commercial interest, technological utopianism, and geopolitical rivalry imagines tabula rasa landscapes with faint regard for climate adaptation, community consent, or the natural, material and social topographies that must combine somehow for endurable futures.
The thing is about, these scam futures, is that the future keeps going, even if all is revealed to be a scam.
We bring the past out of the land and bear the land into the future. But at the heart of all is the land, contested, exploited, and beloved. The turbines, plantations, the missile test sites. We pass and fade on the face of the earth, sun nets drifting over distant hillsides, the cloud shadows. We become the half-sensed ghosts.